Now, leaders have started arriving in India's capital city of New Delhi for the G20 Summit. The leaders of the world's major economy will kick off their discussions to coordinate policy on food security, debt problems, climate action and the war in Ukraine. Now, several leaders are already here. UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has landed in New Delhi. He was accompanied by his wife Akshata Murthy. Sunak is expected to urge more support for Ukraine during the summit. Apart from that, a discussion on the India-UK trade deal and immigration policies is also highly expected. Leaders from Japan, African Union, Bangladesh have also arrived for the G20 summit. Earlier today, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni and Argentine President Alberto Fernandez arrived in New Delhi. Meanwhile, United States Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said that she will focus to build support to increase lending resources for the International Monetary Fund.
This week also provides an opportunity to discuss debt relief. We continue to support efforts to provide predictable, orderly, and timely debt relief to countries, including under the Common Framework for Debt Treatment, where progress has been too slow.
European Council President Charles Michel says that it is difficult to predict if the leaders can reach a consensus on a declaration.
I'm just observing that last time when we had the last meeting of the G20, we succeeded and we had a common statement, we had a declaration, and I'm observing that for some countries it seems to be more difficult today to agree on a clear position, condemning and also sanctioning Russia for this decision to launch this war against Ukraine.
Apart from this, India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi is scheduled to hold a string of at least 15 bilateral meetings throughout the weekend that are also starting today, out of which at least 3 of them are expected to take place. As per tentative schedule of bilaterals being held by India, Prime Minister Modi will meet with US President Joe Biden, Bangladeshi Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, along with the Mauritian Prime Minister. Now, for more on this, we are being joined by Siddhant Sibul. He is our principal diplomatic correspondent, joining us from the ground in New Delhi. Also with us is, to give us more insights, of course, is Ashok Kumar Mukherjee. He is a former permanent representative of India to the United Nations. Welcome to the broadcast, both of you. Siddhant, I want to quickly start with you. World leaders have started arriving for the G20 summit. How is the mood on the ground?
Well, right now I'm at the Bharat Mandapam, which is the venue of the G20 Summit, and lot of foreign delegates have started to arrive. We just came out from the press conference of the Indian Sherpa, the Foreign Secretary, the Indian Coordinator, and extensively they talked about India's priorities. But the big question remains on if there will be a joint statement. Now, there are challenges ahead for India in terms of China challenge, who has been opposing many of the negotiations in terms of the Ukraine challenge, given the divide between the G7 and Russia and China on the other side. But of course, India wants to give its imprint on the global governance architecture. India wants the voice of the global south to be placed at the high table and has invited the maximum number of countries of the global south in any G20 so far that has taken place. But all in all, I can say that India is putting up its best foot forward, and here on the ground where I am, it has not only showcased its digital revolution, whether it's the UPI or Aadhaar, but also its crafts, culture and cuisines.
Absolutely. Now, Ambassador, the US President Joe Biden is all set to land in New Delhi. There are clear differences, of course, over the Ukraine-Russia war and how both leaders see the global south. But, something that has been seen is that over the years, New Delhi and Washington have somehow found an isolated space of diplomacy, where even with changing geopolitics, somehow bilateral engagements have continued. I want to ask you this. Do you think the bilateral meeting that is slated today is going to reflect the same?
I think that the bilateral meeting is a continuation of the discussions that took place a few weeks ago when Prime Minister Modi was in the United States for a state visit. There are certain priority areas which have been identified by both sides. They relate to transfers of technology as far as India is concerned, and exports of technology as far as the United States is concerned. I think it's important to differentiate the two, because transfers of technology are of critical importance for India's emergence on the world stage. So this is an area where I think there will be discussions and some forward movement will be registered. Similarly, the United States and India have had a long partnership in development issues. Most people probably take it for granted. But the United States has been a partner bilaterally and multilaterally of India's development programs, including through the United Nations. So I think there will be some discussion on the way forward as far as development is concerned. And here it's very important to focus on what the United States brings to the table to carry on its leadership role in sustainable development issues. Because in 2015, when the world adopted Agenda 2030 and the 17 SDGs, the United States had been very much party to these negotiations and outcomes. So today, the question is, when the world is almost unanimously agreed that the Sustainable Development Goals have slipped a lot in the last few years, what is going to be the proposal and the push that will come out, including through this bilateral meeting? Because, as you said in your introduction, India is positioned itself to reflect the aspirations of the developing countries of what is called the Global South. And they have their own priorities for sustainable development, which are very well known.
Absolutely. In terms of what India is pushing for, it becomes crucial what United States brings on the table. You make a fair point there, Ambassador. Siddhant, the Indian Prime Minister is going to hold 15 bilateral meetings starting today, of course. If you could just briefly take us through what is New Delhi expecting from these?
Well, every multilateral groupings meeting provides ample of opportunity for the world leaders to engage with their counterpart. And in-person engagement is something that many were missing during the COVID times. And this Delhi summit is no different. The Indian Prime Minister, as you pointed out, has 15 bilateral meetings today. It's with Mauritius, Bangladesh, and with the US President. The all-important bilateral, I would say, in many ways. But essentially, as the days progresses, he's going to meet with Turkey, Comoros, Nigeria, other countries as well. There is a pull aside with the Canadian Prime Minister. There is a luncheon meeting with the French President. But all in all, the Indian side is going to not only reaffirm the strong partnership and relationship with these countries, but also talk about the challenges with respective countries. If I can talk about just today's bilaterals, starting with Bangladesh, close relationship with India, but essentially there is an election looming in Bangladesh. That is something that is dominating the discourse in that country, but election in the region impacts other countries as well. That could be essentially something that is on top of the mind of policymakers in Dhaka. When it comes to Mauritius, it is the Indian Ocean situation, the stability of the Indian Ocean, and thirdly, it is the US President meeting. This will be a bilateral meeting coming after that state visit of the Indian Prime Minister, and on the table will be various defense deals, or whether it is the strong people-to-people relationship between the United States and India. There are a lot of Indians, the Indian diaspora play an important role in the governance structure of United States, and these are things that bring these two countries together.
Ambassador Mukherjee, I would just want you to zoom out a little from India and US. There's so much to discuss in the 2 days of the G20 Summit that is, of course, coming up. There are clear differences, not just between India and US, but there are 20 countries we're talking about here, of course. But there's also need for an action-driven plan that India has been constantly pushing for. I want to ask you this. How optimistic are you about a fair result from this summit?
I think to assess the result of India's presidency of the G20, we need to look at the sectoral meetings which India has hosted. You know, we have hosted over 200 meetings in 68 cities in India in the past year. And the big sectoral meetings have given results. There has been outcome in the use of digital technology for development. And the G20 development ministers have agreed to formulate a framework of principles and how digital technologies can be applied for development. And that includes India's own use of digital technologies through the GAM Trinity network. So that's one area where there is forward movement and an agreed path forward. The second area is on the Indian initiative actually taken to focus on ancient grains and agricultural practices and to revive in the context of sustainable agriculture. And in the G20 agriculture ministers meeting, they have agreed on high-level principles for food security and nutrition. So that is a takeaway, which is already there on paper. Similarly, on climate issues, India has been probably one of the most active G20 countries on climate action. And apart from the International Solar Alliance, which today is headquartered in India, and the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, which India has a secretariat to support, there is an interesting forward movement in the G20 meetings on the biofuels alliance and moving towards a global framework for helping countries to transition from fossil fuels to environmentally sustainable fuels like biofuels. So these are big areas where there has been movement forward, and the area which India has actually introduced into the G20, which I think will be carried forward by Brazil and South Africa, is the area of people-to-people culture and culture as a living bridge to connect the people of not only the G20 but the wider world, including what correspondents are calling the Global South. So these are areas of convergence and takeaways, if I may call it that. Many people talk about this area of divergence between the G7 and the rest of the G20 on Ukraine. Frankly, I, as a person who's dealt with this issue in the United Nations, I find it very strange that when the G20 is called the premier global forum for economic cooperation, then why should that forum have to deal with a political issue? The issue is squarely on the agenda of the United Nations Security Council. And I would say that if the Security Council has failed to resolve the conflict in Ukraine, then that's all the more reason for the G20 to come up with a call for reforming the UN Security Council. And that's it. I mean, there is no other contribution that the G20 can make to the Ukraine conflict.
Absolutely.
And when we look at the impact of the conflict, then I think that it's very clear. There are now documents available, including the United Nations General Assembly. It adopted a resolution in December last year, where it called for a ban on unilateral sanctions, which have impacted on developing countries. So if we are to take the UN as an input for discussions on Ukraine, we have to take the totality of the UN, and not only one resolution which was adopted in March 2022.
All right, Ambassador, you actually summed up the entire summit that we are expecting and the discussions that we are expecting, of course, very briefly. And thank you so much for doing that. And thank you for speaking with us, Ambassador Mukherjee. And also, Siddhant Sabul, thank you for getting us all those insights from the ground. It was a pleasure to speak to both of you.